Tech and clips.
Yeah. Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. Name is Philip. This is Philiminizzyvlogs. Yes, this channel we do music reactions to your favorite songs, your favorite bands, to your favorite artists, and if this is the kind of content you are very much interested in, stick around. If you're new on here, you're very much welcome. Join the family. So I love no negativity up in here. Yes, today we are back with more of these documentaries, this history of our favorite bands that we check out every week. I try to do this kind of content every now and then, so at least we all, I mean, personally for me, I've been listening to music from all these bands, but don't really know much about them, so I feel like once in a while, take a step back, check out their history, check out a few facts about them. And this channel, I always shout them out, and the beat goes on, is responsible for putting these kind of content. So very much enthusiastic, to be checking this one out. This one is, as per the title, you can already see this one is coming from Simon and Garfunkel. Simon and Garfunkel. Yes, we've been listening to their music, Bridge Over Troubled Water, The Boxer, Sounds of Silence. They do very good music. Yes, so without wasting much time, without further ado, let's check out a brief history of this duo, Simon and then Garfunkel. Let's go.
Queens, New York City, 1952. Fourth grader Paul Simon is impressed by his public school 164 classmate, Art Garfunkel, as he sings in the school's talent show. Paul likely was already aware of Art before that, though. The two had grown up just a few blocks from each other.
Whoa.
However, it wasn't until the 6th grade when the two became friends while acting in a school production of Alice in Wonderland. Paul played the White Rabbit, and Art played the Cheshire Cat. Both Paul and Art loved music. In particular, they were big fans of the Everly Brothers and a new genre of music called rock and roll. Soon the two were singing together. They listened scrupulously to records, and they'd watch each other's mouths while they sang. This attention to detail would form the basis of the harmony for which they would later become well known. Eventually, Paul and Art decided to start their own band with 3 other friends called the Peptones, and they started recording and performing at school dances. By the time they were in high school, the Peptones were no more, but Paul had started writing songs of his own. At first, they were imitations of the doo-wop style they both loved so much. In 1956, they wrote their first original song, The Girl for Me. Paul later said it was a, quote, neighborhood hit. Paul's father, Lewis, who was a musician himself, was so impressed with the song that he sent a handwritten copy to the Library of Congress to register a copyright.
Okay, sorry guys, I had to put this. I mean, so this right off the top is talking about, their beginning, humble beginnings, and pretty much you could tell, it's so evident that Paul and then Art Garfunkel, I mean, having friends, since like the 6th grade, since they were little, they grew in the neighborhood not too far from each other. I mean, both of them loved music, so I mean, they had something definitely in common. And when that happens, it's so easy to flow with that person. So yeah, basically that's what they're talking about so far, and so far so good. I'm loving this already. Let's go.
Trying to remember the lyrics to the Everly Brothers song Hey Doll Baby, Paul kind of accidentally wrote a song called Hey Schoolgirl. After Art added his parts, they decided to record the song at Sanders Recording Studio in Manhattan, paying $10 to do it. In a stroke of luck, the owner of Big Records, an independent record company, was at the same studio while they recorded. His name was Sid Prosen, and he liked what he heard. Frozen wanted to sign them immediately, but Paul and Art were both minors, but no worries. Their parents signed the record deal, so it was all good. Frozen had them re-record Hey Schoolgirl, and Paul's dad even played bass on it. In 1957, Big Records released their first single under the band name Tom and Jerry, and Hey Schoolgirl was a hit. Now, apparently there was a bit of shadiness that went down that helped it become a hit, though. Payola! Frozen bribed the DJ Alan Freed $200 to play the single on his radio show. Regardless, Hey Schoolgirl soon was played by DJs on AM pop stations around the entire country. The song hit number 49 on Billboard's pop chart. Art and Paul even appeared on American Bandstand. Now, this all happened while they were still attending high school. Needless to say, they became very popular in school. They were only 16 with a radio hit. However, this fame didn't last long, and their next two songs, That's My Story and Our Song, were flops. They did make some money from selling over 100,000 copies of Hey Schoolgirl, though, and with that money, Paul bought a new guitar and a new car. After crashing the car a few times, the carburetor burned up, and he watched the first money he made from music also burn up. Don't worry, he's doing okay now. Paul and Art both graduated from Forest Hills High School in 1958. Around that time, Paul made a solo record under the name True Taylor. However, he hadn't told Art about it, who only found out apparently after Big Records had released it. This really upset Art. According to the book Simon and Garfunkel Together Alone by Spencer Lee, published in 2016, quote, "Even now, Art cites this as typical of Paul's behavior. Their first big argument, and one that has been repeated several times. In 1980, Paul Simon told Playboy, Artie looked upon my solo record as a betrayal. That solo record has colored our relationship. I said, Artie, I was 15 years old. How can you carry that betrayal for 25 years? Even if I was wrong, I was just a 15-year-old kid who wanted to be Elvis Presley for one moment instead of being in the Everly Brothers with you. Even if you were hurt, let's drop it. But he won't. He said, you're still the same guy." Unquote. Not placing their bets on music careers, they decided to take the more conventional path and go to college. Simon studied English at Queen's College, and Art studied architecture before switching to art history at Columbia. In reality, though, Paul wasn't fully giving up on his music dreams. While attending college, Paul honed his songwriting skills and started to build his knowledge of the business side of music. He made several trips to England to play the folk scene there. He recorded with the Mystics and Tico and the Triumphs, and wrote and recorded under the monikers Jerry Landis and Paul Kane. Not only that, he wrote and performed demos for other artists, at one time even working with Carole King. Meanwhile, Art hadn't given up music yet either. He composed and recorded a song for Octavia Records called Private World. After graduating from Queen's College in 1963, Paul reconnected with Art, who was still studying at Columbia. They started composing together again and got immersed in the New York City folk scene. By the end of the year, they were performing as Kane and Gar, mostly at local open mic nights. Their three go-to new songs were Sparrow, He Was My Brother, and The Sound of Silence. That last song got the attention of a dude from Columbia Records named Tom Wilson. Wilson let Paul and Art audition for the record label, which was kind of a big freaking deal. The audition went well, and Columbia signed them in early 1964. Beginning in March, they recorded their first songs for Columbia, which included that aforementioned song, The Sound of Silence. Wilson produced it himself, and it was entirely acoustic. On March 31st, the duo first performed publicly as Simon and Garfunkel. Yep, just their last names. And I'd say it has a nice ring to it. Columbia released their debut studio album, Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. on October 19th, 1964.
Wow,
The
that's a long
album's
time ago.
iconic photo was shot at the 5th Avenue, 53rd Street subway station in New York City. Now, Columbia didn't even release a single prior to the album's official release, and the album ended up being a flop. It only sold 3,000 copies. Disheartened, Art returned to college, and Paul returned to England to work on solo stuff. He toured small clubs and got more into the folk scene there. Paul actually became somewhat of a hit in England, and the BBC started playing his music under the name of, Paul Simon. In June 1965, Paul began recording his first solo album, The Paul Simon Songbook, and Columbia released it in August. Meanwhile, Art had graduated from college and even began working on a master's degree in mathematics. Then, Dick Summer, a late-night DJ at WBZ in Boston, began to play The Sound of Silence on his radio show, and it began to become popular with a college audience. Soon, other stations were playing it along the East Coast. After Tom Wilson heard about the success of the song, he went back to the studio and added drums to it, and also replaced the acoustic guitar with electric guitar. And he did all this without even asking the duo. Simon would later be, quote, horrified when he first heard it. Wilson got the remix to radio stations, and Paul decided to return to the United States based on the song being a hit. By January 1966, The Sound of Silence was #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. By the end of the year, it would sell over 1 million copies. Because of this newfound success, Columbia pressured Simon and Garfunkel to quickly record a second studio album titled, you guessed it, Sounds of Silence, released on January 17th, 1966. It included the newly re-recorded title track, as well as many other standout songs like Kathy's song April Come She Will and I Am a Rock, which also became a smash hit, peaking at #3 on the Billboard Hot 100. Another hit off the album was Homeward Bound, but actually it was a hit when it was released on a later album, peaking at #5 on the Billboard Hot 100. Despite Simon and Garfunkel not being entirely satisfied with Sounds of Silence, since they felt rushed recording it, it was a commercial and critical success, peaking at #21 on Billboard's Top LPs chart. In fact, it's today preserved by the Library of Congress and the National Recording Registry. Simon and Garfunkel decided to spend more time on their follow-up album. They spent 9 months on it, and Paul insisted on total control on much of the recording process. Columbia released their third studio album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, on October 24th, 1966. The album hit #4 on Billboard's Top LPs chart, and critics adored it. This was the album Homeward Bound was released on again. Other singles off the album included The Dangling Conversation, Scarborough Fair Canticle, and the 59th Street Bridge Song. Scarborough Fair Canticle and the 59th Street Bridge Song didn't become hits until later. Even songs that didn't make it on the album became hits, like the single A Hazy Shade of Winter. Meanwhile, the duo had mainly played the college circuit for shows. Most of their college campus shows were immediately sold out. They were totally not rock stars, and sometimes described as, quote, quirky on stage, but they didn't care. They rarely appeared on TV, but did make it on the Ed Sullivan Show, the Mike Douglas Show, the Andy Williams Show, and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. On February 27th, 1967, Columbia released another single of a fun little song by them called At the Zoo, one of Paul's many tributes to their hometown of New York City. However, by this time, Paul was sick of releasing singles. Throughout the rest of 1967, Simon and Garfunkel attempted to make their fourth studio album, but Paul admittedly struggled with writer's block during this time. Columbia Records was apparently worried about this writer's block, so they hired producer John Simon to help kickstart things for the duo. Well, this made Paul particularly angry. Meanwhile, a director named Mike Nichols, who was a huge Simon and Garfunkel fan, asked Columbia if he could license their songs for his movie called The Graduate. Eventually, Paul and Art agreed to write 3 new songs for the film. 2 of the songs, Punky's Dilemma and Overs, were rejected by Nichols, so they offered another incomplete song that later became known as Mrs. Robinson. The working title for Mrs. Robinson was originally Mrs. Roosevelt, but it was changed to reference Annie Bancroft's character in the movie. Well, both the movie and the song were huge hits, garnering both Grammy Awards and Academy Awards. Mrs. Robinson eventually hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Simon and Garfunkel also continued to perform live throughout 1967. One big highlight was the Monterey Pop Festival, which they not only performed at, but also helped put together. By early 1968, Simon and Garfunkel had finally wrapped up recording of what would become their 4th studio album, Bookends. It mainly took so long since they were perfectionists in the studio. The duo was a bit more experimental with these songs. Columbia released the album on April 3rd, 1968, right before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It was their only concept album that went through a life journey from childhood to being elderly. The lyrics were pretty deep. One of the standout songs on it is Save the Life of My Child, a highly produced song about suicide. Then there's the song Fakin' It, which addresses what we now call imposter syndrome, and the aforementioned Punky's Dilemma, a song that includes the lyric, I wish I was an English muffin about to make the most out of a toaster. I'd ease myself down, coming up brown. Voices of Old People is exactly that. It's just 2 minutes of elderly people talking. That all said, the album also had plenty of radio hits. In addition to the aforementioned At the Zoo and Mrs. Robinson, Bookends featured the singles America and A Hazy Shade of Winter. Most critics also adore the album, and with its success, Simon and Garfunkel were now considered among the most famous musicians in the country, if not the world. Heck, they were probably the biggest music duo in the world for sure. And of course, that meant the beginning of their demise. Some argue it started when Art became interested in acting. Thanks to his connection with Mike Nichols, he landed roles in some of Mike's films, like Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge. Because filming for Catch-22 lasted so long, Simon and Garfunkel's music got pushed to the back burner. They did tour the United States in late 1969, and while Art was acting, Paul continued to write new songs. After the tour wrapped up, the two returned to the studio. They quickly put together what would become their 5th and final studio album, Bridge Over Troubled Water, which ended up being not only their biggest selling album, but most critically celebrated of their short career. Paul and Art recorded most of the vocals in it separately and had largely been doing their own thing. Columbia released it on January 26, 1970, and it featured the singles The Boxer, Cecilia, El Condor Pasa, If I Could, The Only Living Boy in New York, and the title track, of course. That title track is arguably their most famous song, and it has been covered by more than 50 other artists. Bridge Over Troubled Water ended up winning 7 Grammy Awards. It went on to sell around 25 million copies, making it literally the best-selling album of all time up to that point. Most critics today argue that it's their best album, and it was number 172 on Rolling Stone magazine's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list. There's even a documentary about the album called The Harmony Game. Sure, they were more famous than they had ever been, but had also drifted more apart than they ever had. The two were going in a different direction musically, and Art had seemed more interested in his acting career. Most importantly, they just weren't getting along anymore. They played a few last shows together in the spring of 1970, but shortly after that, but again, at the height of their popularity, decided to break up. Still, for the rest of the 1970s, they reunited for several concerts, even though the two rarely spoke. Their first reunion was for a benefit concert for the Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern at Madison Square Garden in New York City on June 14th, 1972. Not missing out on an opportunity to capitalize for profits, Columbia released a greatest hits album that very same day that eventually sold more than 14 million copies in the United States alone. Both also had successful solo music careers, of course, but by 1980, both of those careers had stagnated a bit, much like the economy of New York City, actually. To help revitalize the city, a concert promoter named Ron Del Center suggested a free concert in Central Park featuring a reunited Simon and Garfunkel.
Okay.
Both agreed, and Del Center held the concert on September 19th, 1981. Simon and Garfunkel played to an audience of more than 500,000 fans, which at the time was the largest ever recorded concert attendance. HBO later bought the rights to a recording of the concert for more than $1 million, and it created a renewed interest in the duo. Paul and Art decided to put aside their past differences and went on a world tour the next year. However, due to continued disagreements over a variety of stuff, they didn't record any more new music together. Paul did go on to have a very successful solo career for the rest of the 1980s. In 1990, Simon and Garfunkel were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but both were kind of cold to each other. When Paul wanted to play Central Park again in August 1991, this time he declined an offer from Garfunkel to perform with him. For the rest of the 1990s, they rarely spoke at all. Still, jump ahead to 2003, and they got back together yet again for a performance at the Grammy Awards after receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. Since their performance was so well received, they agreed to another world tour. They called the tour Old Friends, which is a reference to one of their songs, as well as a reference to their lifelong friendship. However on and off it may be, they reunited again for some more shows in 2009 and 2010, but Art suffered some vocal damage, and their last ever performance together as Simon and Garfunkel was at the 2010 New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival on April 24th, 2010. Today, both Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel are in their 80s. Simon has retired from performing, but Garfunkel, believe it or not, has shows scheduled in Europe for later this year. The two still have a difficult relationship and feel like a divorced couple rather than former friends. In total, Simon and Garfunkel won 10 Grammy Awards and sold more than 100 million records. They were one of the best-selling music groups of the 1960s, challenging bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They are widely considered to be one of the best musical duos of all time. Throughout their career, their music evolved from a standard folk rock sound to a much more experimental folk rock sound. And it actually seemed to particularly resonate with the alienated youth of the baby boomer generation. What stands out about Simon and Garfunkel are mainly two things. First, Paul's superb songwriting abilities. And second, how both really were a yin and yang. What better evidence of this than their mastery of harmonizing together? Both made each other better, and their songs still resonate with the youth of today. This video is sponsored.
Okay. So yeah, guys, that was a brief history of the duo of Simon and Garfunkel. Yes, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. I mean, both use their last names, to form this group, and I feel like that's very give it a nice touch, Yeah. I mean, following the story, I mean, they had a very good beginning, despite the whole the ups and downs and whatever came with it. They survived all that. The fame came, and then both of them, after Art started pursuing acting career, they both sort of saw things a little bit, differently. Everybody was going their own directions. And I feel like for friends who like for two men who have been friends, since they were like little, I mean, they should have been able to resolve whatever differences it was. But I also feel like at the time, Art Garfunkel like sort of resented Paul for doing a solo project. Like if you followed the documentary, and even after so many years, even after 25 years, he still referred him to that action that Paul did. You know, I kind of feel like he still held on to that. That is more or less like what caused a lot of their problems. Because I mean, you guys are a duo, based off of the breaking up and coming back together, like you could still feel there was some level of resentment, and even in their 80s, they are still not. There's still that tension, that rift between them, and I feel like that's not cool. But I mean, they've been inducted into Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Won the Grammys. Like sold millions and millions of copies of their album, and I feel like I mean, they've done whatever they have to do. For the fact that they have songs that has been covered by so many artists. From the '60s. To the point where they even challenged the Rolling Stones and then the Beatles. Like it's just amazing. It makes me understand that okay, back in the day, Simon and Garfunkel were actually a big deal, you know because I mean I started listening to their song, and personally, as much as I feel like they have very good songs, I felt like okay, this is just like a normal duo doing their thing. But I mean, this documentary, shout outs to The Beat Goes On, has given me that insight on the fact that they were a big deal, to the point like I said, challenging the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Like it's just a big deal, and I commend them for all that. It only makes me appreciate whatever they've done, the music, their performances, and whatever as a whole. So yeah, definitely very insightful documentary. Yes, let me know down in the comment section if something was left out by this channel, this documentary. If there are some facts that are not right, please let me know down in the comment section. But I mean, this pretty much sums it. If you ask me, I mean, based off of the little that I've listened and watched, I feel like, I mean, it makes kind of sense. But for you guys that were there throughout this whole thing, please let me know down in the comment section. And if there's something that you guys can also add, please do that in the comment section. Yeah. So best believe we're going to be doing more reactions from this band, Simon and Garfunkel. Like I said, a whole lot of titles were mentioned, in this documentary, and I feel like it is worth checking out. So yeah, stay tuned for all that. Yes, if you're new on here, you know what to do. Check out our previous videos if you like them. Subscribe, join the family. So love, no negativity up in here. Yes, until the next music reaction, onto the next documentary content such as this one. Take care, stay safe. Thanks for watching. Merry Christmas, and then peace out.